After his army returned from battle, a leader looked at his soldiers and said, "We have come back from the lesser struggle. Now begins the greater one." The soldiers assumed he was speaking of another war, another campaign, another external enemy. He was not. He was speaking of what waited for each of them when they returned to their tent, their family, their ordinary life. The battle that no sword can win and no strategy can shortcut. The Sufi masters called it the Greater Jihad, a term that has been so thoroughly misunderstood and misused in modern discourse that its original meaning has been almost completely lost. Jihad, in its root Arabic meaning, is simply struggle, striving, exertion toward a worthy aim. And the masters who spent their lives studying the interior of the human being concluded unanimously that the hardest, most consequential battle any person will ever fight is not against another person, an army, or an empire. It is against the version of yourself that wants to stay comfortable. This is what the Greater Jihad actually means. And here is the battlefield map. The first front of the inner battle is against what the Sufi masters called the Nafs al-Amara, the commanding self, the part of you that wants what it wants, now, regardless of the cost. Al-Ghazali wrote that this is the most treacherous enemy because it does not announce itself as an enemy. It announces itself as a need, as a comfort, as something you deserve. The person who eats past hunger does not feel they are losing a battle. They feel they are enjoying a reward. The person who avoids the difficult conversation does not feel cowardice. They feel wisdom. The person who chooses distraction over the work does not feel defeat. They feel rest. The Greater Jihad begins the moment you can distinguish between what you want and what you need, between what feels like relief and what actually is relief. That distinction is a battlefield, and most people never even realize they are standing on it. The second front is subtler and, according to the masters, more dangerous. It is the battle against the story you tell yourself about who you are. Rumi identified this as the ego's most sophisticated move. It builds an identity. I am a disciplined person. I am a spiritual seeker. I am someone who has done the inner work, and then defends that identity more fiercely than it defends anything real. Because if the identity is threatened, the ego experiences it as death, and the ego will sacrifice actual growth to protect the image of growth. The person who reads about self-mastery but does not change their behavior is not failing to grow. They are actively choosing the image of growth over the discomfort of it. That is a battle lost without a sword being drawn. The Greater Jihad on this front asks one question. What am I doing because it makes me feel like the person I want to be, rather than because it actually makes me that person? The third front is one that every person reading any philosophy of self-improvement will recognize immediately. The initial fire, the moment of insight, the resolution, the morning you woke up and decided everything was going to be different. The Sufi masters called this hal, a spiritual state that arrives with force and leaves without permission. And here is what they said about it. Do not trust it. Not because it is false, but because it is temporary. And the person who builds their discipline on the fuel of initial inspiration will run dry the moment the feeling fades. The Greater Jihad on this front is the battle to build what the masters called maqam, a station. A permanent change in character that does not depend on how you feel today. A practice that continues when the fire has become coals, and the coals have become ash, and the ash is all that is left of the original inspiration. This is the hardest front, because it is the least dramatic. No enemy, no sword, just the quiet decision to continue on the days when continuing feels like nothing at all.
The Sufi masters identified the deepest level of the Greater Jihad as this: learning to act from love rather than fear. Most human behavior, when examined honestly, is driven by fear. Fear of failure, of judgment, of loss, of inadequacy. Even much of what looks like ambition is fear wearing ambition's clothes. Rabia al-Adawiyya, the 8th century Sufi mystic, was once seen carrying a torch and a bucket of water through the streets. When asked why, she said, "I want to burn paradise and douse hell, so that people will stop worshiping God out of fear of punishment or hope of reward, and learn to love for love itself." The Greater Jihad, at its deepest level, is the long work of purifying your motivation. Not just doing the right things, but reaching, gradually, toward doing them because they are right, because they are loving, not because you fear what happens if you don't. That work has no finish line. That is why the masters called it the greater struggle. That is why the masters called it the greater struggle.
4 fronts, one lifelong war. Against desire that consumes, against the image that protects itself, against the fire that fades, and against the fear that has been running your decisions without your permission. The Sufi masters did not say this battle is winnable in the way that military campaigns are winnable. They said it is the only campaign worth fighting. Because every external achievement that is not built on this inner foundation will eventually collapse back into the hunger that drove it. Win the greater struggle. Everything else will follow. Subscribe if this channel is part of your battlefield. New wisdom every week.